Estás viendo Canal América, televisión dominicana para el mundo.
Time for True Show is sponsored by the Office of Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, a periodontal, dental implant and laser specialist in New York City, for over 40 years. Dr. Fialkoff was honored by the International College of Dentists and Pierre Fauchard, and received the Presidential Lifetime Humanitarian Honor from the White House. Call us at 718-229-3838.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your fears.
Welcome to A Time for True Show. I'm your host, Dr. Bernard Fialkoff. It's a pleasure to be back with you again tonight. And most of you have been asking, well, how do I avail myself of all the previous episodes? Well, you go to YouTube, A Time for True Show link, click on it, click subscribe, and we'll be happy to have you as one of our viewers. And on this segment, we're going to go over something very important, and I'll introduce it by saying this, that as a surgeon of 43 years, I have many people visit me who are uncomfortable with what they were told at some other location, some other office. And recently I had a young woman come who supposedly had to have her tooth extracted and to have a dental implant, which obviously is a very lucrative thing. But being that I'm the son of a doctor, and a Cuban doctor at that, Ruben Fialkoff, and a mother who was a pharmacist, Raquel, I was brought up a certain way to have honesty, integrity as a doctor. And I looked at the patient and I said to her, I looked at your x-rays, I looked at everything we've looked at in your mouth, and I'm at a loss as to why you should take this tooth out. I think you should go to your dentist and see. You may need a root canal, but the tooth looks good. And she was very happy. And we sent her back to her dentist. We didn't take her tooth out. We didn't do an unnecessary procedure. And I introduced the show this way tonight because sometimes I look at what's going on as a health practitioner, as a father, as a grandfather, and as an immigrant to this country from Cuba. And I say, what is happening? And so I want to introduce our special guest tonight, which I think you're going to find tremendously informative. His name is Robert Whitaker. Let's put up his pictures, engineer, who's an American journalist and author who's won numerous awards as a journalist covering medicine and science, including the George Polk Award for medical writing and the National Association for Science Writers Award for Best Magazine Article. He started as a science reporter for the Albany Times-Union in New York, and in '98 he co-wrote a series on mental illness for the Boston Globe that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. His first book, Mad in America, was named by Discover Magazine as one of the best science books of 2002. Anatomy of an Epidemic won the 2010 Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award for the best investigative journalism. He is the founder and publisher of madamerica.com, that features research news and blogs by an international group of writers. Whitaker is also clinical assistant, adjunct professor at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. Engineer, if you will, let's bid a warm welcome to Mr. Robert Whitaker. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure being back on your show.
It's a pleasure to have you. The last show we did was a blockbuster. You woke up so many people in America. And I want to get right to it because I know you have a wealth of information. And my concern is the youth of our country, because the youth is the future of the country. And I'm very biased, but being an immigrant and being able to have this country of freedom, the United States of America, founded by the revolutionary leaders, all of them, regardless of their race, creed, or religion. And we have to look at the beauty of this country. And what is the real beauty is the future of the country, which are our youth. So I wanted to ask you to go a little bit into some of the problems and difficulties that are besetting our youth and the future of our country. So first thing I wanted to ask you is, I had been reading, and you and I had been speaking a little bit about this, that somehow newborns are somehow being diagnosed at very early ages. Please explain this.
Yeah, this is really remarkable. I mean, it still takes my breath away, even though I've written about it a lot. And you know, the story is developed over the last 25 years. But if you go back before 1980, we didn't diagnose our kids with mental disorders. It was seen as mental disorders were seen as more as something that happened to the mature personality. And otherwise, kids were just struggling growing up because growing up's not so easy. But then beginning in 1980, when they published the third edition, when the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that's the moment we're going to start diagnosing kids with psychiatric disorders. That's the moment that ADHD is born, attention deficit disorder. There was no such diagnosis before that. And if we just, and when they first say, and basically what are the symptoms? Well, you don't pay attention in class, you tap your fingers too much, sometimes you talk too much, that sort of thing. So there's no biological marker for it. But you can trace the rise of ADHD to show how we're changing how we think about our kids. Initially, it was going to be like, oh, 2% of the kids have this problem. Then by 1987, it was 3-4%. Then in 1995, when they did DSM-4, a man named Joseph Biederman, who was a psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital, said, oh, no, it's really 5% and 10%. And if we don't get these kids diagnosed and treated with stimulants, drugs, they're going to have problems when they grow up. They're going to be more likely to be delinquent, do poorly in school, that sort of thing. Well, he was sort of the Pied Piper, for example, of ADHD, and then I'll get to what else he did. But what we see from a diagnosis that didn't exist in the 1970s, now it's hitting what, 10% of our kids, 12% of our kids, wow. That sort of thing. And why what is one of the forces that made this happen? Well, in 1995, when Joseph Biederman really became the Pied Piper, he was paid by a lot of drug companies that make stimulants to, in essence, promote this diagnosis. And he would come out with this research. He was publishing a paper every 2 weeks or something that would say, if you don't diagnose it and you don't give them this, they'll have terrible long-term outcomes. And they built up a market for stimulants. Just real quickly, when the National Institute of Mental Health they ran a trial to see, does stimulants help kids grow up? It was called the MTA study. And what they found in this study, at the end of 3 years, kids on drugs that were so everybody gets diagnosed. One group gets behavioral control. The other group gets medication, stimulants. By the end of year 3, being on drug was a marker of deterioration, not of benefit. And at the end of 6 years, the medicated kids had worse delinquency symptoms and more likely to become functionally impaired. But we never heard about that because they were building this market for drugs. That's part of the betrayal of kids. But then what else happened? Once we began diagnosing kids with ADHD, the next thing what happened was we'll diagnose them with depression. Now, prior to the 1990s, depression was understood to be a disorder of the mature personality. It happened to young, people over 18, because it was understood that moodiness among teenagers was just normal. But then people who were getting paid by drug companies, who had now brought new antidepressants to market, drugs like the SSRIs, Prozac, and these other new SSRIs, the market was being saturated among adults, they said, kids are an untapped market. And so what happened in the early 1990s, for example, these people getting money, very prominent psychiatrists from pharmaceutical companies said, oh, we used to think teenagers didn't get depression or mood disorders. Now we know they do. And that's when you began this effort to prescribe antidepressants to teenagers. But they had to reconceptualize depression as something that happened to moody teenagers. It wasn't just moodiness, it was depression. And now once they do that, what happens in the mid-1990s? Well, new antipsychotics come to market, drugs like Zyprexa, risperidone, Seroquel. And they said, once again, kids could be a market for these drugs. And Joseph Biederman in the late 1990s started saying, yes, these kids have bipolar disorder, and we can diagnose it's a genetic disorder, even hits kids, shows up when they're 2 years old, and we can start prescribing antipsychotics to 2-year-olds. We'll diagnose it in 2-year-olds, and we'll put them on antipsychotics, and they're going to have this condition for life. 2-year-olds. Now, how do you diagnose manic depressive illness in a 2-year-old? What came out, so this one doctor is promoting ADHD, juvenile bipolar disorder, is that he was getting paid by the makers, for example, of risperidone. And he was getting something like $1.6 million from the makers. And what he promised them in documents, he said, I will show that juvenile bipolar disorder is real, that it can be diagnosed in kids as young as 2 and 3 years old, and that antipsychotics are beneficial for them. And in essence, they're going to need these drugs for life. In other words, he promised them drugs for life. And by the time, the last I looked at him, he had received money from something like 25 different drug companies for building these markets for psychiatric drugs in kids. I'm sorry I let on so long-winded, but this diagnosing of kids and putting them on drugs and off polypharmacy is really, you're robbing kids of their right to be children, their right to grow up, their right to make something of themselves.
It's unbelievable. No, you're not, you know what? You're not being long-winded at all. I think it's important that you say and communicate what you were doing and what you were relating to us, because it's so shocking. It's unbelievable. Sometimes I've heard this from different articles and of leaders who didn't really have the best intentions for the world. And I don't really want to even mention their names because they're such a horrific people who cause tremendous harm in our world with tremendous wars. But one of the things that this one leader said is that the fact that it was too incredible what he was leading and doing, that the incredibility would be a fact that people would never believe it, would never look into it, and it took an end of a war to find out what this horrific human being had done with his leadership. So I think what you're saying, I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense that a newborn, 2 years old, even 3 years old, could be diagnosed and put on psychiatric drugs. I know my own third child, when he was born, used to cry a lot. And, but then, what I tried to do is try to get him in a different environment. If he would fall, I wouldn't overreact. I would let him cry a little bit, leave him alone. I wouldn't say, but I was quiet, realizing that if I maintained quiet and he would come out of it, he used to. And he was very interesting. He'd come out of it and he'd pop up as if nothing had happened. So as a soccer coach, when he was in soccer, when he was now about 9 years old, when all the kids, they'd fall on the field and they'd hurt their knee or whatever, and they're on the ground crying, and I'd run out before anybody could get out there and start talking. I'd keep everybody quiet, and I would say to the kid, "What happened?" And the kid would cry and yell at me, and then I'd say, "Where did it happen?" And and I'd say, "Oh, how do you feel now?" And the kid would go, and he'd look at me like, "Who are you?" And he'd pop up and he'd go back into the game. And the parents used to love it because they saw that I was trying to really get the kid to be his own savior and self-dependent and not a victim. So what you're saying to me makes so much sense. You know, I want to ask you something, and because you have done so much research, I can see you've done so much research in this field. To me, it seems to be that this great device is like the tricorder that Spock used to use on Star Trek, that this cell phones, or computers that we have really, to me, it's caused a lot of harm to our youth. What do you feel about this?
Well, you know, they are amazing machines, but we have a lot of evidence now that they are causing harm to our youth. And you can identify, the research is even, I mean, you can sort of understand just intuitive why it's not good for kids to be on their phone for 8 hours a day. But you can see what happens with this once kids incorporate the smartphone into their everyday life. And here's what the research shows. First of all, the amount of time kids end up spending on smartphones is just astonishing, you know, per day. What do they find? By the way, they find the earlier you start with a smartphone, the higher the risk you'll have anxiety and depression by the time you're 18.
Interesting.
So like if you start at 6, it's worse than starting at 9. But what happens when you make this the centerpiece of your life? You move less. I mean, you're just like this, right? You're not out in nature so much. You're not going out in nature so much. You're not having face-to-face playtime with your kids, not nearly with your friends, going out, etc. So you're not in nature. You're not in nature. You're not having social time with each other. And you're not moving around as much. And you're not even having so I think all this shows up in the literature, by the way. All these things the life changes where the phone becomes a centerpiece. Your social interactions diminish. Your physical time with others diminishes. And actually your sleep becomes more problematic because you're looking at your phone at the night. All these things are harbingers or forces for being unhappy, for feeling that you're anxious, you're not as popular as some of the other kids. Anyway, that research is really well established, and it shouldn't be a surprise. What do you think when you were growing up? What helped you? What was your life like? Did you have friends? Did you spend time with your friends?
Absolutely.
Did you have dinner with your family and talk? Did you go out in nature and play? So this is what's happening, is it's showing that it's completely changed how our youth grow up, how they spend their days. I saw something when Mad in America, you mentioned, I have this website. We just did a big story, a long story about looking at the evidence for why this is so harmful, the type of studies. And this is a type of thing that they're pinpointing. And I'd say the biggest thing is being face-to-face with people, with kids. And by the way, being with kids where you're out playing outside in the playground or whatever, you're making your own rules, you're your sort of your own social organization. Your parents aren't telling you what to do all the time. Anyway, these kids get isolated, they lose their sleep, they're always feeling they're missing out on things. So it's a way of being and organizing yourself that is so different than how kids have grown up for thousands of years, for forever, in essence, in terms of being with family, being with others, being with aunts and uncles. And it's isolating. And what do we see now when we have a generation now that were raised with that phone you had in your hand, right? What do we see by the time they're 18? We see skyrocketing rates of suicide, skyrocketing rates of anxiety, skyrocketing rates of depression. So we're 20 years into this way of growing up that is so different than any population has grown up before with the smartphones. And it's all showing to be a disaster for the emotional health of our youth. But it's not a mystery. I mean, go back to your own growing up. I can guarantee you can feel how important it was to have friends, feel how important it was to be, in a social milieu with others, and to run around and be in nature, that sort of thing, and to have family dinners, all those sort of things are being replaced by a phone, and it's obviously an impoverishment of what it means to grow up, or the opportunity to grow up.
You're so right in what you're saying, because when I grew up in Manchester, Connecticut, in my neighborhood, we would just always go out, and the parents weren't afraid that a car was going to run you over, or that some dog was going to bite you. And there were dogs running around. There was nobody with electric fences. And we were on the road. We'd play hit the bat. And so that was on the road that we played hit the bat. And, the cars would stop, the cars, and we would see the car, and we'd all go to the side. The car would go by. We didn't have, cameras on the side of the road to patrol. We didn't need that. People in our neighborhood would just drive safely because kids were out playing. We didn't need signs. And you're right. I mean, the other thing that's very interesting, and I've seen this published somewhere, but I tried it the other day. I had a long day at the office. My office is in Queens and Bayside, and it's a corner brick house, so it has a nice lawn. So at the end of the day, I decided, I'm going to try something that I've heard. And I took my shoes off. I left my socks on. I took my shoes off, and I went on the grass. And I walked on the grass, and I have no scientific study. I have my emotions and what I felt. And it was very interesting because it felt different. And it's what you said, going back to nature. It almost seems like these different dynamics of nature, of the trees. I mean, the trees give us oxygen, obviously, and without them, we don't have oxygen. And you say to yourself, well, it's such a miracle that somehow God put all this together, right? And you have trees, you have grass, you have animals breathing the oxygen, giving the carbon dioxide to the plants and the sun, and there's an interaction. And it's interesting what you're saying, because it seems like with the technology, we're interrupting this energetic flow that's in a lot of different spiritual and humanistic philosophies. And what's interesting that I actually want to point out to our viewers is scientifically, the Surgeon General of the country just recently came out with many, many statements to wake up the country on the importance of social interaction, community activity, and the fact that it was not just an opportunity, but an obligation or a duty for us to start interacting more, because he had found out in studies, in scientific studies, epidemiological, and some looking back retrospectively, and research of review articles, that the reality was that the physical and mental well-being of our United States population is being affected what he called an epidemic, which is a disease rampant, of isolation, which is lack of communication, interaction, isolation, and loneliness. And, he called it an epidemic. Very interesting, because he found that with science. And, as we're speaking and you're talking about our future generation, I'm saying, well, how is that going to be positive for these young people? And if that's the way they are, I'm going to be 70 in June. So sooner or later, I don't want to, but I may need their help. And if this is what I'm creating, I'm going to end up being the victim of my own lack of betraying these children. What do you think about this?
Well, I don't think there's any function of a society more important and more important than raising healthy children. I think that is the most important thing that a society does. And it's not just raising them to be, you want to raise kids to be, successful adults, competent adults, have self-reliance, that sort of thing. But you also want to give being a child is a gift. If you're around a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, they're so delightful because they're so curious. They want to know the world. And they just go through the world with these big open eyes, and they the they'll go from one thing that's fascinating to another thing that's fascinating. And what I'm saying here, a society should give this time to children to experience all the things you're talking about, because it's such a gift to children to have this chance to play, to be with others, to be out in nature. I love your anecdote about feeling the grass under your feet. You know, I remember sleeping outside in my backyard. It was so fantastic, looking up the sky and that sort of thing. So how important is this? I think the most important thing a society does is create an environment for children to become responsible, to enjoy life, to feel the mysteries of life, to feel the joys of being with it. And also, by the way, growing up's trouble. It's difficult. You're going to have your difficult times. You're going to have struggles with people, that sort of thing. You're going to struggle with your own mind. But we need to give children that gift. They're born, they have, in my opinion, a God-given right now to try to make something of themselves, to have this experience and become responsible for themselves. And by the way, civilizations existed for thousands of years before they gave drugs to their kids at age 2. So somehow they managed to raise their kids. But that's what I think we're doing, is we're stealing from kids the right to grow up, to feel this, and to come to grips with their own mind, make their way through life. That's what we're robbing. And when we talk about the extent of the harm, think about this. 25% of our kids entering college, or to 30%, are arriving with a diagnosis, arriving with a prescription. And that means they've gotten this message that they're mentally ill, they're not quite right in the head, they have something wrong with their head. That you could hardly give a message to a child more destructive than that. So, you know, now I know I'm on my soapbox right now, but I think what we're doing to our kids is basically criminal. We're taking away their God-given right to try to make something of themselves.
You know what, Robert Whitaker, it's a pleasure to speak to a father, a grandfather, a professional who has the health and wellness and future of our country and its youth and families in mind, and realizes that the greatest economy that there is the wealth of a healthy community, the wealth of relationships, and the wealth of the United States of America. Unfortunately, the time has come to end this show, but for those of you watching, let's protect our kids. Let's give them a chance, like Mr. Whitaker said. Let's protest this drugging that's happening of youth in our country, and let's give them a chance to have a normal life. We hope you enjoyed this segment. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure again.
Thank you. Have a great night, and we'll see you on the next episode of A Time for Truth show. Good night.
This show was sponsored by A Time for Truth Foundation Incorporated as a community service.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got. But the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your feet